After our lengthy discussion on nimba weak verbs, we could write down the homework. Sorry that the lesson wasn't up on the website in the time where it's supposed to be on. My webmaster wasn't. He meets two disciples that are running away from Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus. Trying to run away because they're afraid for their life. They don't believe anymore that Jesus is Messiah because he's dead. Okay? So even his disciples, they're stupid. In the book of Mark, his disciples are stupid. They're ignorant, arrogant, stupid people that don't understand what Jesus says. They say they do, but they don't. So once their last hope for the kingdom is destroyed with Jesus being killed, they think, well, was he a liar? Was he a failure? He's dead. They don't expect him to rise again. So they're running away from Jerusalem because if somebody sees them, those people that saw him walking with Jesus, they're going to recognize them and they're going to do the same thing to them as they did to Jesus. Because it was prohibited to preach his name, to say his name, and do anything. It was later on, after the resurrection, that apostles got their guts back and started to preach openly in the temple and so on. But after his death, immediately, they were running away. So we read the story about the Garden of Gethsemane. Mark was running away, even left his Versace suit behind him, you know. Yeah, even his Reebok sneakers wouldn't hold up. He was running so hard. Peter, yes, he was trying to follow Jesus at a distance, but when he was discovered, he denied him, and then he was probably too ashamed to even continue following. So when you put all these different details, you come to that conclusion. And Jesus meets them on the road when they're fleeing from town, and they don't even recognize him until he does certain thing that he used to do with them. Okay? So. It's not anything new. We read before that 500 disciples left him at one time, then 70 disciples left him. Yeah. Only 12 remained. And then out of this 12, he only could trust 3. The rest of them were kind of wishy-washy. All right, so there is your photograph. John was also one of the 3 closest disciples to Jesus, together with his brother James and Peter. Interesting. Remember that whole story when mother of James and John comes to Jesus and say, "Let my son sit to your left and to the right of your throne"? And he says, "You don't know what you're asking about, woman." Because that means they would have to share in his suffering if they want to be to his right and to his left. He was actually saying to her, if you would only imagine what my throne is like, which is the cross, and if you want James and John be on my left and on my right, you wouldn't be asking for it. And we know that James is the first martyred disciple in the history of the church. He actually shared the destiny or destiny of Jesus. And then John was the only one that didn't die violently. So it's interesting. His brother was the first, and John was the last. Isn't that interesting? In one family, one was able to have an honor of being the first martyr for the Christian faith, and the other one was able to see how it all developed through the first century. He died probably 90-something. He was the oldest one of the disciples. He was able to see how the second and third generations of Christians were living out the Christian faith. And Jesus says to Peter, "What do you care? If I wish that he would remain alive, it's not your problem." What he was referring to, that all the disciples will be dead and John will still be alive. But they were thinking that he will live forever. fact, there's some Catholic heresies that say that John is still alive. John just left the building.
Serious.
And by the way, Elvis has just left the building. Same thing about John. John later went to Ephesus, and pay attention to all these red things. That might appear in some sacred writings. And,
Some papyrus.
yeah, some papyrus. He was exiled to the island of Patmos. On the island of Patmos, I think they had sulfur mines where they dug up some sulfur. Of course, if you work at the sulfur mines, the first thing to go is your eyesight, because sulfur was eating through all the how would I say, not the extremities. It's basic. Well, I don't know how to explain it. Forget about it. Just take it as it is. Traditionally, John was the only disciple who did not die violently. He died his own natural death. Yes.
What was the idea behind exile? Was that just so that he couldn't speak about Jesus anymore?
He was a political exile by Roman emperor who was persecuting Christians. So probably he was not the only Christian on that island. It was the way to isolate him from big land, because it would prevent him from spreading the gospel. And probably correspondence was limited. Maybe no correspondence was allowed at all. In the movie Apocalypse of John, we see that John is discipling a lot of young people, and they are acting out some of his commands and sending out some of the forbidden books to the big land, and he's using some of the Roman guards as well. It's interesting fiction. I don't know if it was in reality, so it's interesting. This is one of the representations of John, and as you see, there's a cup with a dragon coming out of it. This is actually emblem of John, his heraldry. The chalice on a red background with a dragon coming out of it. Probably because of his imagery of a dragon coming out of the sea in the book of Revelation. I think. And the cup of judgment that is about to come to earth. And he is presented here as a young boy. We know that John was the youngest of the disciples. So Peter was probably the oldest. That's why he took the position of leadership. He was probably older than Jesus as well. Date and setting for the book. Since John's 3 epistles and Revelation were written after his gospel, the probable range for this work is between 60 and 90 AD. Either before destruction of Jerusalem or after destruction of Jerusalem. Since he's not mentioning anything about the destruction, it could have been omitted because it's not a very important fact, since he is preoccupied with Jesus being Son of God and not anything else that's happening in Israel. Or maybe he's writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the memories are too painful in his mind, so he doesn't want to even write about it. Okay. John wrote this gospel from Ephesus. So we know he didn't write it on the island of Patmos. Usually, stereotypically, people portray John with a book on the island, writing his book of Revelation and so on and so forth. On the island, he was working his tail off. It's when he came back as an old man, he was able to finally, in peace and quiet, write some books. Because I think writing was forbidden on the island. They were working, and the work was punishment. This is another representation of John. He's writing a book. We don't see if it's the island or not. We see a raven or an eagle. Looks like an eagle in the lower right corner. Probably his imagery of God, of Jesus Christ as Son of God, is actually a representation of eagle. It will put parallels to John, Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Matthew represents Jesus as lion, Lion King. Lion King, or not Lion King, there is another one. Lion. Mark represents him as an ox. Luke represents him as a human being, man, and then John represents him as an eagle. Those were actually 4 pictures on the banners of Israel encampments in the Old Testament. So the 4 Gospels kind of parallel those imageries of Jesus. Which is interesting because Israelites were not supposed to make any engraved images or any other images. How come they had banners with human figure, eagle, ox, and lion? Yes?
So in Revelation when it talks about the Isle of Patmos, that's probably where he had the revelation, but he wrote it down.
Yeah.
So.
He probably had a revelation there. Which was, of course, questioned by a lot of critics because they said, well, maybe after breathing so much sulfur, you'll see all kinds of different visions.
Just don't see them when we're away.
Yeah, so it's one of the remarks by critics. But, whoever doesn't believe, they won't believe. They don't believe not because they can't, but because they don't want to. Did you have a question or something? Theme and purpose of the book. The purpose statement could be found in John 20:31. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Newspaper clipping from the Jerusalem Times in 33 AD, portraying all the people that were murdered. But it's actually probably most realistic image of Jesus, or Jesus' suffering, out of all the films that were made about Jesus in all times. John selected the signs that he used with the apologetic purpose of creating intellectual and spiritual conviction about the Son of God. And if you study theology, those are 2 aspects of the person that are mostly used in theology: intellect and spiritual conviction. Otherwise, if you take away spiritual conviction, it will become philosophy. Because philosophy is a science of intellect. It asks a lot of questions, but doesn't give any answers. The key verb in John is believe. And it requires both knowledge and volition, meaning will.